Yeah. Yeah. Here she goes.
Woohoo! Once again, good morning to everybody watching us live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, of course. Timothy, you look great this morning. Very nice to see you. No wind around you, no waves around you. That's good to know. So, thanks very much for joining us and getting ready for this briefing. So, this is Japan Expert Insights, Japanese Politics 101 with Timothy Langley, a long-term resident here in Japan and an expert in the field of Japanese politics and public affairs. So thank you very much for watching. Timothy, I don't want to keep anybody waiting, so let's start straight away.
You forgot to say I'm a registered tour guide.
Oh, really? Okay, so you said it now. Right. Great.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. Today is July 9th, 2023. Today is our episode number 126, Maya. Congratulations.
Yes, it is. Congratulations to you, too. Yoo-hoo.
I was planning on broadcasting from the deck of the good ship Santana, but the wind and the gusts out in the harbor and in the outer regions is just too great for my boat to handle. So since the forecast is the same for today, I decided to come back from being on Santana and reporting from my home office. So that's my excuse today, unfortunately.
So, great, your hair will stay as it is.
So let's get right into the news. Today is the anniversary of the Shinzo Abe assassination, 1 year ago. I'm going to be getting into that and some of the implications. There's a lot going on in the press about that, remembering what Mr. Abe brought to Japanese politics, what his legacy was, what was the foundation of his almost 9 years as prime minister in 2 stints, and the legacy that he left in creating or in fostering the development of what has become known as the Abe Faction, for purposes of defining Japanese politics, even now, a year after his death. So we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about the Abe Faction, where it stands right now, what their weight is on, current Japanese politics and that sort of thing. But first of all, let me get into what's the contemporary news that's of importance today. You can't have missed that the Fukushima release of the radioactive water is really reaching a fever pitch with the visit of the IEAE director into Japan just this last week. So we've been talking about this on this briefing for months now, that the Japanese government has authorized and is planning to release the water, the radioactive water, into the ocean directly within a couple of months. They are unspecific about the dates, but it gets the okay from Tokyo Power Authority, received the okay from the Japanese government, and a kind of a blessing. So you get a lot of parties who have some influence over that to kind of spread out potentially the blame should something happen. But nobody wants it to all fall on the Japanese government, and certainly TEPCO doesn't want it to be on its shoulders if there is any repercussions. So they had the IEAE come in and review the policies, and they gave it a stamp of approval. They said it meets all international standards. So if you want to release it, we're okay with that. Similarly, with South Korea, you know that Japan has been building these ties with South Korea under the auspices and the encouragement of the United States to have this bilateral relationship more robust and stronger, so that it can be a defense mechanism against North Korea, and potentially as a greater part of deflecting what China might have, what aims China might have on Taiwan. And it seemed to be actually gaining a lot of traction. So the South Koreans, too, they sent a delegation 2 weeks ago that we reported on. They came, they met with a lot of people, they visited the plant, they visited with the prime minister. And then just this last week, they also passed a resolution that said we respect the decision of the IEAE with regard to the release of the radioactive water. So it looks like all the boxes have been checked, and it looks like Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi left Japan yesterday after about 5 days here. He met with residents of Fukushima and the plant area. Actually, he received the prime minister received him as well. Can you turn that off, Maya? Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
The prime minister, a lot of press on him coming as if Japan was waiting for his final blessing. I don't think that's the case, but I think it does highlight to the Japanese public and to the population at large, and also to the neighbors around Japan, that this is going forward. So as it stands right now, 500 metric tons of radioactive water will be released at some point. This water has already passed through what they call the advanced liquid processing system, which removes most of the radioactive nucleotides except tritium. And tritium, I guess, is something that they just can't extract by any viable methods to date. So it is going back into the ocean water with the tritium, but with a dilution of an amount that is less than what tritium exists in nature, or how it's being produced in nature, so that they're going to stay below what nature actually produces in tritium. So that is the argument to justify this. But in any event, the water just keeps piling up in Fukushima. There must be a solution for this. I know that they've spent a lot of time and energy and technical know-how in removing the nucleotides from the wastewater. It's not just wastewater, but it's mostly the wastewater that was used in cooling the reactor as it was going through its meltdown phase. But there's lots of material and metal and concrete debris as well. But at least, first of all, they need to reduce the water. Any kind of major earthquake could have ruptured or could rupture some of the holding tanks. So it is an issue that must be resolved one way or the other. And this is the resolution that the Japanese government has reached. So as it stands right now, they will release 1.3 million metric meters of the water, probably in a staged release. This is equivalent to about 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools, but it's a process that's going to be ongoing for many years. In fact, the director of the IEAE actually said it's going to take several decades, 30 to 40 years. And as a consequence, IEAE will set up a permanent on-site office in Fukushima to oversee this and to handle any issues that might come up. So they're in a major process now of trying to quell concerns. The South Korean delegation released a report just this last week in South Korea. So there's lots of opposition in South Korea too. There's a large faction of the population that really has a lot of animosity directed towards Japan still. And one of the ways that this comes out is anything that comes out of Japan just has a no mark on it. So President Yoon is working hard to quell that. There was a big event in the major fish market and produce market in Seoul, where they had television cameras and radioactive Geiger counters, that sort of thing, to show the population that there is no issue, and then probably they're just forming a baseline measure of how the fish are now, because once the release is, what is the impact on fish that are being consumed in South Korea. Similarly, in China, which is very opposed to the release of the water, there's been some reports that China's release of waste into the South China Sea is far worse than anything that TEPCO is doing or plans to do into the Pacific. That's a completely different issue, but they are continuing their ban on Japanese foodstuffs, cosmetics. The foodstuffs are from 10 prefectures. That's been going on since 2011, and it's caused a lot of friction between the countries. Japan and China have a very close trade relationship. For South Korea, China is, their number one trade partner. I think for Japan as well, they're their number one trade partner. So foodstuffs and cosmetics, high-end um, uh, 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 manufacturing processes are a main Japanese export. So this is really going to hurt the economy here. Um, the person who is in charge of this is Yoshimura Yasutoshi, who is the industry minister. His name will come up a couple of times. He is in the Abe faction and is one of the five leadership members who are kind of guiding the Abe faction. His name is going to come up later in this briefing. But these significant names in Japanese politics, Mr. Seko, Hagiura, Yoshimatsu, Nishimura, come up time and time again because they've passed through the election process 5 or 6 times. They're prominent in politics, and their names will come up because they are pretty much at the forefront of helping to guide Japanese politics with the prime minister. So important to keep their names in mind. The other thing that's going on is my number. You've heard about this if you've been listening to this briefing, but also this last week, it was announced that the digital agency will go through an inspection by the Personal Information Protection Commission. It's kind of like the watchdog of what's going on, and they're investigating the digital agency. So the minister, Kono Taro, has said, we accept and we look forward to their on-site investigation. This is very rare. He's admitted that there have been some issues with the card. 940 incidents since its inception. 70%, 72% of the Japanese population has signed up for the My Card, My Number system. So it's a lot of people. It's still a voluntary system, but there is some opposition, not just because of the glitches. The glitches, the whole system is run by Fujitsu. So Fujitsu is also going through an on-site investigation by the Personal Information Protection Commission. So it's a pretty big deal. It's another slap at Kono Taro for his administration. I don't know why it's particularly devoted to the digital agency, but the digital agency is almost 2.5 years old. It was cobbled together very quickly. If you're familiar with Akasaka, it occupies 3 floors of one of the office buildings in Akasaka Mitsuke. They threw it together, and actually they didn't have enough of the technocrats and the people with the skill and the experience to man the administration of this brand new agency. So they had to go out to the private sector and recruit people who are working at Cisco, at Apple, at Microsoft, give them a status as a government worker, give them a salary that was commensurate with what they were working or receiving elsewhere, or maybe even being seconded by these major companies to fill those steps. So it is somewhat understandable, maybe, that there are growth pains, but also My Number system is a huge system, and the tolerance of the Japanese population for mistakes with regard to personal information that's controlled by the Japanese government are just apparently intolerable. I don't know if that's an overstatement. I think it's just one of those things, another barb to throw at the Kishida administration by those who are opposed to him, the opposition parties, or even people within the LDP who don't like Kono or who don't like the prime minister and want his term of office to be, ended sooner rather than later. There's a lot going on in Japanese politics with regard to that. There was no snap election, as we all know, but there still is a chance that there might be a snap election before the Diet goes into session again. In fact, this My Number system is considered to be so serious that they had a special session of the Diet on that just this last week, even though the Diet is out of session. They did that on Wednesday to discuss what they're going to do. So having the Personal Information Protection Commission come in for an on-site investigation, potentially to administer what is known as administrative guidance. For those policy wonks here, administrative guidance was one of those key phrases that was used maybe 10 or 15 years ago to describe and explain how METI at that time was able to dictate to Japanese industry how things are being done, who is producing, what are the costs, through the issuance of administrative guidance also to foreign companies that are operating here. So it's a key technique of the Japanese government to exert control and dominion over some of the ministries and some of the companies that are doing business here. So the merger of the My Number card with the health card system, which is mandatory, will be in autumn of next year. So I think part of the reason for the opposition and part of the reason for the administrative guidance potential coming out, and I think there will be an issuance of that. In fact, the digital agency produced a comprehensive report in June, and apparently it was not broad enough, deep enough, stringent enough. And so the Kishida administration, with a lot, I mean, just over June and July, the number of incidents of misidentification or the wrong bills going to the to individuals, or actually different people's personal information being revealed to different people, maybe with the same first name and last name, has jumped up. So it could be the incidence of that. It could be cracks in the Fujitsu system. Who knows? But a lot is going to be discussed there. Let me see what else is going on. Wednesday. Oh, the other thing that's come up is that the My Number system, people are returning their cards. They're refusing to, they're opting out, in fact. So with 72% of the Japanese population invested in this system, they're holding separately their insurance cards as well. In autumn of next year, they're going to be merged. People are saying, no, enough of this. I'm not going to do it. If it's a voluntary system, I quit. 20,000 My cards were returned to the government just last month. Since the inception, people joined, they signed up for it. Since the inception of the My Number system, 470,000 have turned around and said, no, this isn't for me. Forget it. I'm out of here. So it looks like it might be something that could be on the chopping block, but I know that the central government, the Prime Minister's office, is hell-bent on making the country and the administration digitalized. So digitizing society is a major component of the Kishida administration, and also of just many of the laws that are being passed to economize and to incorporate in an easy fashion the way information is being handled and controlled and secured in Japan. There have been a couple of breaches. There's another breach that came out of Nagoya this last week too that I'm going to be talking about. But the Japanese government is committed to doing that. So the digital agency was set up to incorporate all of the ministries together, and then to spread that out to the regional offices, and then from there, in due course, to the population in general, the businesses, how companies are run, corporate executive shareholder meetings, and that sort of thing, so that somebody, probably the central government, the Prime Minister's office, has the ability to observe and analyze and maybe create laws for better security. But this is an issue that's not going to go away very quickly. So in the next couple of weeks, we will be reporting on what the administrative guidance is, what the impact is on Konotaro. He is taking a political hit on this just because he's in the crosshairs. And that delights some people and really concerns other people. The other thing that's going on in Japanese political economy right now is the wage growth has eclipsed what the Japanese government predicted it would be. So if you'll remember, the spring wage offensive, which ends in May, and then people get elevated bonuses, they get their salaries increased by a certain number of percentage points. That starts in May, and then it carries out throughout the year. And it really is guided pretty much by the large trade union, particularly Rengo, which is the amalgamation of all the trade unions in Japan, and they negotiate with the Japanese government and with some of the companies on behalf of their workers. And they succeeded in generating wage growth that was just historic. 30 years. It's the best wage growth that employees have had, probably around 3.3% a wage increase, which means that their salaries got kicked up a couple of percentage points, and then maybe they got, in some instances, a very hefty annual bonus. So the annual bonus is not repeated year after year. So the commitment of the companies to repeat that year after year, but for the year that it is issued, wage growth is reflected in that. And so the Japanese companies have increased the wages probably around 2.1%. But with inflation growing at a clip of about 3.4%, actual wages have decreased by about 1.2%. So although the Japanese government is trying very hard to grow wages so that this virtual cycle that Mr. Kishi has talked about, where wage growth is in harmony with people purchasing more products and more investment and companies growing, and then they spit out dividends to their shareholders, and then they spend more money. It's beginning to show maybe green buds growing from the ground. At least that's the way the Bank of Japan is looking at it. But their assessment of what the inflation rate should be, they're shooting for 2%. They've overshot that now, but there are signs that it is beginning to have some impact. We won't know. They're having a Bank of Japan meeting at the end of this month. We don't expect any big issues there, but if you're watching the yen value, it has fallen. This time last week, it was 145 yen to the dollar. It is today, I think, 142, which is a pretty significant increase in the value. But once the Japanese yen hits 145, certainly 150, intervention looms. And the last time they did that was October of last year, with a tremendous infusion of Japanese capital to cool that down, to bring the yen value lower. I think they don't want to do that. So it is significant that it's fallen by maybe 3 yen over this last, or yes, 3 yen over this last 2-week period. So it's something to keep your eye on. Wage growth is also, the prices of goods continue to rise. It's a bad sign because the trajectory of rising prices, we talked about maybe 7,000 products, consumer products, going through price rises in July. And in August, the subsidy that the Japanese government pays for fuel costs will be removed. So those costs will once again go up without the Japanese government subsidy. So the rising prices for consumer goods is continuing to grow. I don't know if wages are going to continue to grow, but what happens is, with the successes in the spring offensive, other companies are beginning to mimic that, and it is beginning to spread out throughout the economy. So everybody enjoys what the benefits are gained from the labor negotiations in May. That's probably died down, but with the number of people that are searching for jobs and the number of jobs available, prices for employment are set to rise. Who knows if that really makes any difference with the inflation continuing to grow? So they're watching that very, very closely. There was a trade delegation, you might have noticed, that went to China, headed by Kono Yohei. Kono Yohei is the father of Kono Taro. He was the Speaker of the House when I was working in the Diet. He is, I think, the only individual who became president of the LDP who did not become prime minister. A very powerful, very influential individual. His son is minister of the digital agency and a candidate for prime minister. He someday will become prime minister. I think that's easy to say. And that's why this attack on the digital agency and the inflection that maybe involves his leadership and his management abilities is something he truly wants to avoid, because there will be an election for prime minister at some point. He's still young in his career. So the fact that his father is visiting China, his father has always been known to be close to China and one of the members of the LDP who has continued to have those relations with China. He went on a trade delegation this last week, spent almost a week there. Pretty important. You might have missed it in the press because it's somewhat long read and a little bit boring if you're not involved in the trade issues. But he went there. He was joined by the governor of Okinawa, Denny Tamaki, and they talked about trade. They talked about the semiconductors and the fab machines that are being withheld from Japan to be sold in China. That ban starts in the middle of this month, I think on the 24th. But yeah, on the 23rd, the export restrictions will start. And so in this conclave that the delegation had, and they had very high access, actually, the premier of China said, these restrictions on trade will impact the global economy. Sounds a little bit like a very veiled threat, very, very veiled. So if you're going to do this to us, then you should be prepared for repercussions on a global scale. You will suffer from as a result of that. So they talked about, supply chain. They talked about Japan's uncomfortable relationship with external forces, not mentioning anybody else by name. But the fact that Governor Tamaki was also there is really interesting. I'd like to get into that a little bit. Let me see the fact that he was in China and received so warmly. Denny Tamaki was. He was also invited to Fuzhou City, which was kind of the launching point for the trade relations between Okinawa and China many, many years ago. And as you might not know, Okinawa was a vassal state of China for about 500 years. It was actually closer to China than it was with Japan proper. And in any event, Japan was going through the warring stages, the warring period. People weren't invited. Delegations weren't coming into Japan for trade missions and that sort of thing. So Okinawa played that role as a trade arbiter between Japan and China, and they had a very strong tributary relationship spanning 500 years and two Chinese dynasties. So the relationship there is very, very strong. That relationship ended in 1879 as the Satsuma clan invaded Okinawa and annexed it. And so the Satsuma clan took over that trade and all of the representations that it included. It did cause a lot of problems between Japan and China. China at that time was suffering from British rule as well, so it was a ripe time for the Satsuma clan to go in there. But this history just continues to impact on what's going on in current events. So this friendship with Okinawa, this opening of arms with Denny Tamaki, and if you've visited Okinawa recently, you will notice that there's a lot of Chinese investment there. There are a lot of Chinese that are doing business there, running companies, and they want Okinawa to be much more friendly to China. And although 70% of the U.S. Military presence in all of Japan is focused in Okinawa, and this is a bone of contention that Governor Tamaki has, he's been negotiating with the central government to release some of the aid and some of the support that other prefectures get. Okinawa is the poorest of all prefectures. It's got the highest birth rate, but still the lowest economy. And so with the U.S. forces there and the tropical kind of environment that it has, you would expect that it to be a much more vibrant economy, but it's not, and it's not for a lot of artificial reasons that are political in nature. So this this relationship with Denny Tamaki and the Chinese delegation, he spent a lot of time with Kono Yohei as well, which is a good thing. So it's this relationship between China and Japan seems to be getting a little bit better traction. There are other things that are going on that I'm going to talk about with regard to the prime minister. So it's an interesting development there. It's something to watch. The other thing that's going on is the Osaka Expo. You've heard about that. It's a big deal. It happens once every 20 years. And this year it will be in April of 2025. So it's about a year and let me see, almost less than 2 years away. But the applications for building pavilions has not materialized. So the Japanese companies go in, they have an artificial island that they're producing there. They're going to build the expo there. And then the expo, after the expo, it's a 6-month expo where they showcase all new technology. It's kind of like the World's Fair. It's a version of the World's Fair for Osaka. It's a big deal for Osaka in particular. But what it does, it also helps boost the infrastructure of the site where the Osaka pavilions are. So people will come in, some of them will build somewhat temporary structures. Some of the structures will be permanent, but it's for economic development for that region. And they invite other countries to purchase the building sites, have the pavilion, and then 6 months later, they leave and the pavilions stay there. The problem is that the permit application period opened in April and nobody's actually submitted. The United States, Canada, Holland, Great Britain have not submitted their applications for building these pavilions. This is a pretty big deal. Typically, the foreign countries will buy a pavilion to showcase their technology, their special companies that are doing extremely well. There are 3 types of pavilions. In a Class A, which the foreign countries qualify for, and those will be, in different sizes: 3,500 square meters, or 1,700 square meters, or 900 square meters, A, B, or C. But nobody's come in to purchase those, and the problem that the Osaka government has been receiving is that the construction costs are high and that the cost of materials is difficult to secure. So countries are not being very enthusiastic about purchasing the building sites, and the construction must be done by Japanese companies. So it's a huge boost to the Osaka economy. So the governor of Osaka has gone to the central government and said, look, you need to help us out here. There's a little bit of concern with provision of materials and also laborers here. New law is going into effect that insists that companies pay now overtime for construction workers. That will kick in spring of next year. That's going to probably scare other people away. But I think that the deal here, it's more of a political one than, well, it's made out to be an economic one. And that's because Ishin now has the governor's position, has the mayor's position. It holds the majority in the prefectural assembly and in the city assembly. And this rubs up against what's going on in Tokyo with the Kishida administration. So there is a little bit of gamesmanship, I think, that is being practiced here. So who knows what's going to happen with that. But if nobody shows up for the Osaka Pavilion, Osaka is going to be in the hole and it's going to have a black eye. And maybe that's part of the design, this negotiation that's continuing to go on there. But anybody has any relationship with Osaka, the Osaka Expo is such a huge deal. So let's see how that develops. I'd like to talk about another issue that's hit the press. The port of Nagoya suffered from a massive hack. You might not have heard about this, but it shut down port facilities on Tuesday, Wednesday, and they just came back on track on Thursday. The hack was initiated by a Russian group known as Lockbit 3.0. It was ransomware that was issued to the port of Nagoya, which was refused, and then they had to hire, on an emergency level, 60 technicians to come in and recompile the data. The report is that they didn't pay the ransomware, but they came back online within 3 days. It's not fully back online, but the port of Nagoya, as you might know, handles all of the export of Toyota's cars, not just the export of new cars, but also the importation of parts and manufacturing processes that come in both for cars that are being constructed in Japan, but also parts that need to go to export markets as well. So, 40% of the entire export economy of Nagoya, of the port of Nagoya, is on these auto parts. And so it's a big deal for Toyota and for the prefecture overall. So they've resumed shipments, but the whole area there is just clogged with the trucks that are handling these big containers that are offloaded. So it looks like that is an issue that has somewhat been resolved, but it is, I guess, scary that a country can come in and do so much damage and insist on a payment of a fee in order to turn the lights back on. So we're going to continue to watch that, but it seems to be something that is happening on a more regular basis. It just doesn't hit the press that much, but this one in Nagoya for the port facilities is pretty alarming. Let's get now to what's going on with the Prime Minister and Japanese politics in particular. The biggest item is that, of course, this is the 1-year anniversary of the assassination of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He was assassinated, as you know, by Yamagami Tetsuya, a 42-year-old fellow whose mother fell into this swirl of the Unification Church. She donated all of her money. He didn't have any inheritance. His brother killed himself as a consequence of medical issues, and Yamagami was hell-bent on punishing the Unification Church. In a very brief span of time, he manufactured a gun. He tested the gun. He shot it at the Unification Church, and then the following day, in a campaign by the Prime Minister, or the former Prime Minister, in Nara, he kind of slipped through security and fired a couple of rounds and mortally wounded the Prime Minister. Huge issue, a huge shock to the Japanese system that something like this would happen. He's under arrest. He hasn't. He's been formally charged with several counts, firearms, assassination, that sort of thing. But he hasn't gone to trial. There was a court hearing about maybe 4 weeks ago, you might have heard of, where he was going to appear to hear the prosecution, hear the judge's complaints and some of the issues as he prepares himself to go to trial. And since he was going to show up at the court, all of the press were there too. It turns out that there was a bomb scare at the same time. There was a box that was left in the main foyer there. They brought the bomb squad and the trucks. It was a big brouhaha. They opened the box and they found out that it contained a petition of 3,500, no, 13,500 people who were asking the court to be lenient on this guy because of the suffering that was generated by the Unification Church. So the Unification Church hasn't died down. It is still a huge issue. It's kind of being pushed off. And I think in many political circles, if you have an issue that's really nuclear hot like that, you push it off and you push it off and people forget about it. And when it finally comes up and blame is to be there, people sometimes just say, well, that's an old story. It happened a long time ago. It wasn't on my watch. And it looks like maybe some of that is going on because many of the people who were implicated in the Unification Church and the cozy ties that it has with Japanese politics all revolved around the Abe faction and Mr. Abe and some of the key lieutenants who are now in line to take over the mantle of leadership there. So some politicians have already suffered. They've lost their seats as a consequence of that. And there are many others who are keeping a very low profile and hoping that this Unification Church or the the investigation of who was involved and how they were influenced and what kind of influence they exerted on a political basis is still somewhat opaque. It's not very clear, but the investigation continues. His trial is not expected to be going forward until probably this time next year. So there's a lot of preparation for that. And the lesson here is don't get involved in Japanese police issues because it is just unending. And Mr. Yamagami is he's a victim, but he's also a perpetrator. So we'll see how that one shakes out. There's a foreign ministers meeting this week on the 13th and the 14th in Jakarta. It's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And in this one, following up on the issue we were talking about earlier, the foreign minister Hayashi will meet with his counterpart, King, on the sidelines. There are a couple of sideline meetings that will be going on there. Japan will also meet with South Korea, so that relationship continues to flourish. But the important part here is the foreign minister meeting with his counterpart. That hasn't happened for quite a while. The foreign minister did go to China, a month ago, was received by his counterpart. But this is the first time for them to meet on a substantial basis to talk about, in fact, the release of the nuclear water in Fukushima, but also the trade restrictions, which will be going into effect 10 days after they meet. So there might be some concessions granted there. Kono Yohei was just in China with the trade delegation. So there's a lot of action going on there while the Diet is out of it's not in recess. It's just the Diet session ended. So there's a lot of diplomatic stuff going on. It's not just the Chinese and the Japanese, but it's also the South Koreans too. There's going to be a summit now. They've just announced that between South Korea and Japan in Lithuania. It'll be a 2-day NATO summit. This will be also on the sidelines, but that is going to be occurring next week. And Yoon and Kishida will also be meeting there. This is the first time they've met since May during G7. So this shuttle diplomacy, this energy to kind of bring these two countries together, to have issues of joint agreement on, and to kind of push those that are distasteful or reminiscent of sour times, I think it is really beginning to take traction. And I think a lot of people are happy and helpful for that. Moving on to the Abe faction and what's going on there. So with the 1-year anniversary, people would have thought that the Abe faction would have gotten its act together and decided on who the leader is going to be so that they can be more prominent in guiding Japanese policy and politics. So as we all know, the Abe faction is by far the largest faction, 100 members there. But they don't have the push under the one voice that Abe provided. And they don't have any leader that was, prominent enough or has enough, gratitude of 100 members. Mr. Abe apparently did. But even when it came time to select a candidate for prime minister, Mr. Abe went out of his faction and chose somebody who wasn't a member of his faction as his candidate of choice. And he instructed the Abe faction, the 100 members, to vote for her as well. There was a big controversy there, a little bit of a rift in the Abe faction, and he had to back off, and he told people, vote, with your own convictions. I'm not dictating to you who you should vote for president. So many of them voted for Sanai Takaichi. Some of them voted for Kono Taro, but at the end of the day, when everything was said and done, it was Kishida that won the vote. So there are people who voted for him inside the Abe faction that have ingratiated themselves as a consequence of that. But I don't know if we're going to have a return to that. But anyway, that tells you that there are rifts even within the Abe faction. Not everybody is, unified on all sorts of issues. So the leadership issue continues to be a bone of contention. As it stands right now, there are 3 scenarios for deciding that. As of Thursday, they've come up with a concoction of a group of 5, 5 senior leaders. It kind of was a group of 7. 2 of them have basically fallen out as of Thursday, so that there are 5 people that will be guiding policies and politics within the Abe faction. I don't know how strong that will be. Time will tell. That was one option that was being proposed. The other option is that the Abe faction split between those members in the upper house and those members in the lower house. And Mr. Seko, who is the Secretary General of the LDP within the upper house, he would take those members in the Abe faction who choose to go with him. So not everybody would go with him, but some of the LDP upper house members would stay with the Abe faction, presumably, and he would initiate his own faction. The temptation there is that he would have one of the largest factions in the LDP if he was successful in doing that. The problem with that, though, is that the LDP presidency has never gone to an upper house member. So even though he might have a significant role in defining Japanese politics, he won't become prime minister. And for every member of the parliament, their burning desire is to become prime minister. That is what everybody wants. And that's why they're in politics, is to become prime minister. So not everybody can, but you do the best you can. So the option of Mr. Seko forming that alliance, I don't know if it really works. The third option is that Mr. Suga, we've talked about this, Mr. Suga with his substantial group melds together with the Abe faction, either formally or informally, and he takes some sort of a leadership role in the Abe faction to negotiate or be the chief negotiator with regard to how Mr. Kishida wants to do things. So without somebody with the presence and the voice like Mr. Abe to negotiate with the prime minister, and the prime minister relies on that 100-person faction to do things so that things stay copacetic and he can get his policies done. And he's not challenged as roughly. Without that leadership, his best policy is to be rather light on details, push his own policy quietly, which he has been known to do, and to hope that the Abe faction stays somewhat not unified. So a unified Abe faction is a huge boost. Obviously, the person who is selected as the leader of the Abe faction would be the candidate for prime minister in the next election. So pushing that off kind of holds Prime Minister Kishida, gives him hope that he can succeed himself again when his term of office ends, or if there's a call for a closing of the House and maybe a vote of no confidence. So we'll see how that one goes. But the final idea there with the Abe faction is that they decide to have the leader of the faction who is ineligible to become prime minister. So he would be the leader of the faction, chief negotiator for what's going on with the prime minister's office and the prime minister himself. But the candidate would come from the other group of 5 who would potentially be the next candidate. And as we said earlier about the Unification Church, there were 7 members here. 2 of them fell out, particularly because of the relationships that they had with the Unification Church. But that net didn't capture everybody. There's still 1 or 2 that have had deep relationships with the Unification Church that are within that group of 5. So it's something to watch for. If there's barbs that are going to be thrown, you'll know who that is. So we're going to continue to watch that because it's an interesting dynamic. It could come out in August because the prime minister, the next shoe to fall in Japanese politics is the prime minister will select he'll reshuffle the cabinet. And the issue with reshuffling the cabinet is what he's going to do with the current Secretary General of the LDP, Mr. Motegi. He needs to kind of move him out because he wants to put somebody that's a little bit more familiar and a little bit more friendly to Mr. Kishida than Mr. Motegi. Mr. Motegi has the third largest faction, so he can't just bat him away. He needs to give him some position of authority. He can't ignore him. And the only position that Mr. Motegi hasn't held within the realm of diet or cabinet portfolios that he could hold is the Minister of Finance. I don't think that's going to happen. So it is going to generate some controversy. It's something to watch very closely. We're going to continue to watch that. Let me see what we've got with the Komeito and the LDP. There has been some movement there. They did set a kind of an agreement of how they would deal with export of lethal weapons. So this is separate from how they're going to deal with political issues in terms of elections. This is more with regard to the Komeito is the party of peace. It doesn't want to revise Article 9. It doesn't want Japan to export lethal weapons. It doesn't want Japan to develop a defense industry, a military industrial complex, as has been discussed. But the economy needs something like that. The Japanese would be particularly good at it. They don't have a military industrial complex now, although Mitsubishi is producing a lot of things, airplane parts and submarines, that sort of thing. So the Kishida administration wants to move that forward. And part of that is, even if you're developing these kind of materials and weapon systems that are lethal in nature, if you can't export them because of Article 9, then it doesn't make any sense. So one of the ideas is to first change Article 9. This is a precursor to that. And they've gotten Komeito to agree to that, that with regard to lethal weapons, weapons that have a lethal capacity, they cannot be exported. But now, with the agreement that they just made on Thursday of this week, as long as these materials, as these systems, as these devices are devoted to rescue or transport, surveillance, vigilance, or minesweeping, it's okay. So they've made an agreement there that these kinds of weapons, even though they might be lethal in nature, and even though under a certain interpretation of the Japanese Constitution, this is not allowed, they have made a concession there. So it's kind of kiss and make up and be nice and get a concession here and get a concession there. So that part of defense buildup has just moved one step further. And then the next news report is Komeito and LDP deciding on what they're going to do with election policy. So we didn't have a snap election. A lot of these issues that we're talking about now are coming up. For example, Mr. Seko deciding he wants to form a breakaway faction within the LDP consisting of his LDP friends within the Abe faction, all come out of the fact that there was no snap election. So the idea of them having a snap election is still alive, but people are changing their tunes as a consequence of that. Similarly, with regard to Komeito, if there was going to be a snap election, there was a lot of controversy over who would get a kind of preferential treatment on running members in certain diet seats. So there are certain areas where Komeito doesn't have a candidate, and they don't have enough pull there. They've only got 31 members in the diet to begin with. So they don't have a candidate in every district, but they've told the LDP, in those districts, we will vote for the LDP candidate, not any of the other candidates, not any of the opposition parties. And you can expect our parties to vote. And Komeito, actually, they're so tightly controlled that the members of Komeito do vote in a way that the party headquarters kind of instructs them. As a consequence of that, in those areas where Komeito has a candidate, they have an agreement with the LDP not to run a candidate, and similarly to instruct their voters, we're not running a candidate in this election district, so please devote your votes to the Komeito candidate who we endorse. And so frequently the prime minister or members of the cabinet will go and speak on their behalf. So that happens in a lot of election districts. And with the new 1010, which is a gerrymandering scheme where 10 votes are taken out of the lower populated areas and pushed into the upper populated areas. That gerrymandering rule will occur now in the next election, and Komeito wants a couple of seats dedicated to them, and there's a fight between Komeito and LDP on a couple of those seats. In particular, Tokyo District Seat 28 and District Seat 29. So the problem there is that the LDP Policy Affairs Chief has a friend who he wants to run in the new seat 28, and Komeito has a person they want there. It's a new seat, so nobody has run in that seat before. And the LDP has basically said, no, you're not going to do that. So in the other adjoining seat in Tokyo 29, Komeito has said, look, we don't even want your help in 29. And as a consequence of that, we're not going to be supporting you elsewhere in Tokyo. So there was a big fight about that. They did come to a conclusion that they will support each other in other prefectures and other election districts. But for Tokyo, Tokyo is going to be a bit of a battleground there. The problem with Tokyo 28 is that they said to the LDP, you know, we don't even want you to participate in, you can run a candidate in Tokyo 28 because we're going to win it. We're going to be strong there, and we don't even want you to be friends with us there. Ishin came up, and they have a very strong candidate that they just announced this last week, a former, I think, Olympic skateboarder, not skateboarder, probably a snowboarder, a female who has run before, didn't win in her election earlier, but is going to come back again with full Ishin support. Ishin is really on a roll, and it explains part of that problem that we were having with the Expo, Osaka Expo, and Ishin taking over the governorship, the mayorship, and both houses in the prefecture side and in the city side. Komeito had a relationship with Ishin. Ishin wanted to combine the prefecture and the city so that instead of it being Osaka-fu, it's Osaka-to, as Tokyo is, Tokyo-to. So the governorship and the mayorship are the same. They fall under Miss Koike. And they wanted to do the same thing in Osaka. And they told Komeito, if you support us on this, then we will vote for your candidates. They did that in one election cycle. Komeito did really well. And at the same time, they defeated all of the LDP candidates. Ishin defeated all of the candidates. They took over the governorship, the mayorship. They took 50% of both houses, and they got all of the seats that the LDP had. So the LDP doesn't have any lower house members in Osaka as a result of that. That period has died now, and Ishin is saying, look, that was before. We're strong now. We're going to be moving forward, and Tokyo 28 is open for grabs, and we have a great candidate there. So the next election is going to be a real hotbed. When we were talking about the election and the possibilities for a snap election, one of the driving forces there was that the opposition parties are a little bit confused. They're not coalesced together. And in that environment, the LDP will always do well unless Komeito decides that they're not going to be friends with each other. The fly in the ointment, though, is Ishin, and Ishin coming up so strongly. So the reason why they wanted to have an election earlier, a snap election earlier, is so that Ishin didn't have the time to kind of coalesce their forces and to get candidates for all of these open seats and also the seats that are potentially up for grabs. So without the Komeito vote in a large majority of LDP seats, if the Komeito doesn't vote for the LDP candidate will lose. So there's a lot of concern with that, and for us that are watching Japanese politics, this is a big issue. It'll become clear as we move closer to that. Let me see. The only other thing I want to talk about that's pretty important is, as you know, Japanese politics is pretty much guided by scandals that are going on. It generates, heat and light and investigations, and people like you, they don't like you, or they cast aspersions, and it damages your credibility. The issue we have now, and it's been reported by Bunshun 3 weeks in a row now, is the vice chief cabinet secretary, Mr. Kihara. He is in the Kishida faction. He's a good friend of Mr. Kishida's, obviously, but he's been involved in a bit of a scandal with dating maybe she's divorced hostess who has a child, and he's been embroiled in that. Pictures have been taken of him going on dates and going to Disneyland and that sort of thing. Mr. Kihara is married, and so this kind of generates not a very good look for the prime minister. But unfortunately, the prime minister really can't afford to fire or to move Mr. Kihara out of his position, because he did that 4 times. 4 cabinet members. It's never happened in a prime minister's legacy to dismiss 4 cabinet ministers. And I think that happened maybe 2 months within his him taking the prime minister's position. It's cooled down. He hasn't had such a big issue since then. But to move Mr. Kihara off, I think he just can't handle that. So he keeps him as his close aide. But it is causing a little bit of concern. The latest article that came out is that his wife has been investigated, or is being investigated, being asked to contribute to an investigation of the murder of her former husband. This is a murder that's maybe 8 or 10 years old. He was found with stab wounds in his throat, and it has so far been an unsolved mystery. And the fact that she's been called in to describe once again what happened is just another one of those flashpoints that guides eyes towards Mr. Kishida and his ability to select the quality and the character of people that he works closely with. So it's one of those issues that, again, it's a little bit prurient and excites curiosity. I don't know how much it has to do with actually politics, but it is one of those things that the Japanese thrive on. So you got to continue to read Bunshun, or leave it up to me to read Bunshun and tell you what the latest is going on there. That's about it for me, Maya. I think I've gone a little bit over. I hope this has been insightful to you that are watching Japanese politics. If you have other issues, if you have a concern, or if in fact your company is facing issues in Japanese politics with your product or your services, please let us know. Please let me know. Other issues that you might have a concern with, link up with Maya and she'll put them on, or actually ask you to come up on the stage and ask them yourself.
Oh, yes, definitely. So thank you, Timothy, for the briefing, and to everybody who is watching us or listening to us. Yes, definitely connect with Timothy. You can find him on Facebook right now. You can find him on Twitter as well, or you can connect with me and with him via me at the moment. Also, I just posted a link for our newsletter, the bi-weekly newsletter, in Clubhouse, the room chat there, so you can stay up to date with our insights and also some of the events that we're organizing. If you subscribe to the newsletter there, you'll get that information straight into your inbox. So please feel free. The newsletter is free, of course. It is free of charge. We're not going to overcrowd your inbox because it's a bi-weekly one. So there is no concern there about that. And well, great. So now we are transitioning into the questions and answers session. Thank you very much, Timothy. It looks like, yes, we have a couple of questions already, but I also wanted to, before I move to them, I wanted to ask you about something, the leadership of the factions actually in the LDP, and particularly the leadership of the Abe faction, because you mentioned that there are 3 scenarios there. One of them, of course, is electing a leader, and the other one is forming a group of 5 people who will lead the faction and decide on policies within the faction and so on. And the third one is Mr. Suga actually. Right. Merging his group with faction as well, and him becoming a negotiator and a sort of a leader. But my question is, how are the leaders decided? So, do people in the faction, the members of the faction, do they vote to choose a leader, or what? Is it done by, or let's say, unspoken agreement by all the members of the faction? So, what is the way of setting or electing those leaders there?
So that's a great question. And if you've worked in a Japanese company, or actually if you've been involved in Japanese culture at all, you know of the senpai kohai relationship. So that is typically based on age. So somebody who is a year older than you, you show deference to. But also, it could be somebody who entered the company before you entered, even though he might be older than you. Um, he should show deference to the person who has more of a legacy, more of a time frame within the company or within whatever kind of relationship that you're talking about. So this kohai senpai goes on in Japanese politics too, but this is mostly dictated not by age, but how many times you have won in your seat. So there's a distinction there too. So there are some members who are voted in an election based on their own name. So because they were a doctor or a lawyer or a member of the bureaucracy, and somebody asked them to become a candidate, and they become a candidate on their own name, and they speak on their own behalf, and they might say, you know, I'm a party member of the LDP or of Komeito or whatever, and I'm supporting them. So if you elect me, I will be joining that political party. Some people say that, and some people say I'm going to be an independent. So I think those people who say right out of the gate that I am an LDP member and I support the Abe faction and the policies of Abe, and so please vote for me, they probably have a little bit more of a preferential treatment. The other thing is that there are other candidates who put their name on the list. So they're elected not as a consequence of their power of persuasion or their personality, but they're on a list of members that are provided by the party, the political party. So the LDP provides its list, and from 1 to 60, if they weren't a certain number of votes because their party is popular, then the numbers will be reflected there. So they might get 60% of the votes, and so a certain number of the seats will go to them, and then another political party got 15%, and they will get 15% of the people on their list. So the distinction there is that a powerful political leader is somebody that comes from not the list, but from direct election because of their personality. The second distinction is that the person who won by the most number of votes, so you might have two people that both came from the representative list, they both won at the same time, but one person had far more votes from members of his constituency than the others. I'm talking about pure numbers. Then he would have a bit of a priority there. And then the third distinction is not just in terms of how many times they've been repeated. So most of the leaders that we're talking about have been reelected 5 times, 6 times. And the individuals that are able to, when they have these political parties or these benkyokai, as we talk about them, when they're able to collect a number of people, like 300 or 400 people who pay nimaen, 20,000 yen for a plate of curry, and listen to a speech, that money doesn't go individually to that individual. It probably goes to the political faction. So if you are able to have, pull within people who want to listen to what you're talking about, it also elevates you because you're contributing money to the party that other members within that faction also benefit from. So they enjoy the largesse of your being a good speaker or being a prominent speaker, that sort of thing. So those are the 3 distinctions. So the people that are in contention for that leadership role have all been in political parties, 5 times, 5-6 times. So similarly, if you've been in the Diet for 3 times or 4 times, it's about time for you to be a minister of some agency. So you might remember we did the Diet tour, and Odawara Sensei, he's been 10 years in the Diet. He's been elected 2 times, 3 times, sorry. And it's time. So he is a assistant vice minister for foreign affairs. And interestingly enough, this individual Kihara-san, who I talked about, working with the prime minister, he held the same position as Mr. Odawara in the previous administration. So it's kind of a stepping stone that once you supply that kind of a role and you have that kind of prominence, and as long as you're not involved in scandals, then you'll continue to go up and be considered for the leadership position. So I know it's a long-winded explanation, but all of these factors culminate to make you identified as a leader. So Shimomura, Sekko, Hagiura, Nishimura, they all, even now, have cabinet-level portfolios. Mr. Sekko is the leader of the Upper House Caucus. Nishimura and has a cabinet portfolio. Hagiura has a LDP internal portfolio. He's probably the second most powerful person inside the LDP bureaucracy there. So these kinds of people are the ones that are notified and acknowledged as the leaders.
Right, but it also tells me that they will be quite probably lobbying against Mr. Suga becoming the leader there and merging his group with the faction.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Why is that?
No. So the deal is that we will accept Mr. Suga to be the party leader. So you coalesce all of our voices, and you are the negotiator between the Abe faction and Mr. Kishida.
Mm-hmm.
But you cannot become prime minister. So we're separating those two, right?
Mm.
We
Right.
talked about Kono Yohei. He was actually the president of the LDP, but he didn't become prime minister. So it has happened in the past. What the idea here is that you have a negotiator, somebody who's the head of the party, but not a prime minister. And so these current leaders, they're kind of thinking, yeah, that actually enhances my ability to become prime minister. So I just need to kiss a little up to Mr. Suga so that he likes me more. And when it comes time to choose, I'm the favorite choice. But in that kind of scenario, it's going to be a faction vote who's going to get that. It's not just going to be, for example, Mr. Suga choosing it. And it's not just Mr. Suga. It could be one of the other party leaders, one of the 5, who says, I'll stand up. I acknowledge I'm not going to be prime minister, but I'll help you guys. It could be that scenario. But I also predict that this is a one-cycle solution. This is not going to last into the future. The person who might be just the chief negotiator, the next time it comes up to be a prime minister after his selectee becomes prime minister, he's going to be a hot contender for that position. So it's.
Yes, indeed. And going back to Mr. Suga, at the end of the day, we don't know what his ambitions are right now, right? Because, he may accept that status quo, let's say. It's not a status quo, it's that option. But at the end of the day, he may really want to become a prime minister again in the future. So they're quite as you mentioned, maybe you should act this, personal ambition factor as well to everything else, to all the mix there.
Yeah, one of the things about Japanese politics is when you're prime minister, your power is somewhat hampered. You're reporting to a cabinet and the press is watching everything you do. If you have a dinner party at your house, everybody wants to know who was at your dinner party and how many times did they go to the bathroom. Once you finish being prime minister, actually your role and your power increases. In fact, this conclave that the LDP Abe faction had on Thursday, Mr. Mori, who isn't even a member of parliament anymore. You might remember that he was prime minister. He was the leader of the Abe faction. It used to be called the Mori faction. He was the chairman of the Olympic Committee. He had to give that up because of comments that he had made that were described as inappropriate with regard to women and just a lot of other things about Mr. Mori. But anyway, his voice held a great sway in how this whole deal is being fleshed out within the Abe faction. So, yeah, I think not being prime minister actually is a little bit easier than being prime minister. But like I said, it is the desire of every member of parliament to become prime minister, and that's why they do what they do.
Right. Well, thank you for the explanation. It's fascinating to actually get the insights and realize that it's not so easy, and there's so many things to consider and so many things at play. Well, great. And just going back to one of the comments on LinkedIn. So here it is. Sorry, but could you please once again clarify what were the reasons exactly why people are returning the My Number cards? So we're going back to the My Number issue.
Okay. The reasons are kind of obvious. One is it was initiated to kind of make things easier for you if you want to sign a contract or you're moving or maybe as a part of your business, to be able to take a card that has been issued by the government and go to the convenience store and get the documents that you need to execute that transaction, as opposed to going to the kuyakusho or the shiakusho or standing in line, accommodating the hours of operation that they have, or maybe the distance that it requires, or making sure you have your hanko or getting your inkansho meisho, all of those things. It's a bit of a pain in the neck, and it is designed to make that kind of administration easier. And the idea was that also you could receive subsidies and money from the Japanese government that normally would come through the post or through the postal service or through the Japanese postal banking. And it might be a little bit easier if you had it all on one card. So there are a lot of services that are being developed and embedded into the My Number system. And the people that are giving it up, just number one, they're saying it was, you sold me a false bill of goods. I thought it was voluntary and it would make my life easier, but I've tried it a couple of times. It didn't make things easier. I still had to go to the kuyakusho, or they made a mistake. Actually, with 72% of the Japanese population having them, with Mr. Kono saying that there's only been 930 incidents, I think there's been more incidents of mistransposed information or mistaken identity, that sort of thing. But still, it's a very, very small number. But still, it is a person's individual personal privacy. It is essential to be protected. And when the government invites itself to manage your personal protection or your personal privacy, and they screw up on it, people have a very low tolerance for that. So I think it's just being fed up and voting by ripping up the card or sending the card back. It's a vote, and it tells the Japanese government, this stinks and I don't agree with it. And the third reason would be that it's voluntary. It was promoted as being voluntary, but now the incorporation of the health card system into My Number, so that the health card system would collapse into the My Number system. They say that's a trick. Now you're making the My Number system actually mandatory, and you did that in the dead of night and through subterfuge. So screw you. I don't vote for it, and I'm going to tell all my friends to turn their cards in too. So it could develop into a little bit of a snowball.
Right. Well, we know that trust issues here they really start small, but they can turn into something huge. So I can see how or why the government is actually really on their toes about this.
Yeah.
Also, there were talks that Kono Taro, the digital agency minister, he actually suggested changing the name of the system from My Number card to something else, which is also, it is a very well-known marketing trick, but the government seemingly or reportedly refused to do that. So
well,
that's so.
Yeah, it's like marketing. It's a marketing trick. I don't know. In a somewhat unrelated area, you might
Mm-hmm.
remember in my report that the Japanese government has instituted that companies that are listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange must have 30% of their boards female
Oh,
by the
yes.
year 2030,
Yes.
right?
I
And
remember that well.
right?
Mm.
And you might remember that I said something to the effect, if you're a female that is in the quasi or in the executive area, this is a great thing for you because in spite of all of the difficulties you've had, you're in that zone. They need people like you. So have hope and confidence, continue to do what you're doing because slots are going to open up, right? That was the
Right.
message that I had. Well, it turns out that now there is a premium on movie stars and singers to be sitting on boards if you're a female. So this is kind of turning everything upside down, and it's not because you actually know what you're doing, but it's because you're famous and gorgeous and you have a hit song and you're sitting on the board of some company, and that is just window dressing 3.0. So
Well, I don't want to be sarcastic, but it also could be good marketing for the companies that offer those board seats, to the singers and TV celebrities or whatever. Who knows?
well, it's kind of, yeah, it kind of puts proof to the slogan that Mr. Abe had, women shine. And when you convert women shine into Japanese, it's women shine, right? So
Oh,
so
oh, yeah.
although we want 30% to be women, but it's not you that we're talking about. We're talking about these guys who really don't have anything to say. It's just it's a marketing position, and they told us 30%. So we have the movie star and the singer who are sitting on our board. Isn't that great? I mean, how depressing and diminishing that must be for people who are in the corporate mechanism and working their way up the ladder.
Yes, indeed. And in other news, actually, we also hear that high school children here, they consider working for companies as just as a way to earn money and nothing else. So, like, not really like they don't see their future jobs as passion projects, if I can say that. So, isn't it a fascinating dynamic here? Just I don't know what to make of these two things, going on at the same time.
That's interesting because I think if you interviewed their fathers at the same time that these teenagers were, I'm sorry, at the same time that these individuals were teenagers, I
Mhm.
wonder what their response would have been. And I think their response would have been, well, of course I'm going to join the company. That's what everybody does. That's what I'm supposed to do. That's why I finished high school. That's why I went to Tandai or I went to the university, is because I can join, the I can carry a briefcase and I can wear a suit. And I don't think that much depth of
Mhm.
thought was put into it. But I don't know. I don't know what the psychology or the reports might say on that. But this is interesting that today's kids are saying, "Look, I'm just going to do it for the money. It's not because I have a passion for working on automobiles."
Or yeah, or I want to, get some satisfaction out of it, or whatever. Yeah, indeed. Okay, and then there is one question in YouTube now. It is from Hiroaki. So his question is about. Okay, so it is everything pending until the coming NATO summit in Vilnius? So,
Is everything pending? So that
yeah.
summit is upcoming. And Hiroaki, thank you very much. Thank you for joining the tour and going to the dinner last week. It was great to meet you in person. Hiroaki is potentially a candidate for prime minister. As I think, if for those of you who
Yeah.
are on the briefing, he's always here asking really good, insightful questions. But yeah, the NATO summit, it's a big deal. I think there will be some decisions that are made there, and this slow amalgamation of NATO and Japan, I think it is inevitable. Japan is already signing agreements and doing dual projects with Italy, with Great Britain, on developing fighters, and this is a big deal that I think NATO is moving into a second phase. Who knows what will come of that? But if it's not NATO, it's probably a different kind of military balance in the Asia Pacific The United States is, of course, going to have a central role there, but there's nobody else but Japan who can handle that. The only thing is they're being hampered by Article 9 of the Constitution. So, given time and given the dynamics that are going on in North Korea and China, Taiwan, it is possible within the next 2 decades. I mean, inevitably, the dynamics will completely change. Japan will reassert itself. Hopefully, the issues of the past will be diminished, and Japan will reassert itself as one of the most powerful nations on the globe, as I think is its rightful place. First we got to get the economy back on track, and the birth rate. I don't know if they'll solve that problem by then, but there's a lot going on to secure Japan's role as a global acknowledged leader in some of these large international organizations. So a lot is left to be seen, and a lot of it depends on the leadership and how the prime minister is doing and what happens with the Abe faction.
Yes, indeed.
Obviously.
And I think that we have seen this trend starting with Mr. Abe, of course. Japan actually strengthening and solidifying its position as an international player on the global stage. So, yes, and well, we know that things happen very slowly here in Japan, but well, when they start happening, eventually, it's like a snowball once again. So we'll see how this plays out, what happens in the next maybe 1 to 3 years.
So just to play off of that, Maya, if you don't mind, sometimes it just requires something of an activant, some salt, or maybe some Tabasco, and all of a sudden things begin to happen. And that activant in Japanese politics is frequently called scandal. So the scandal frequently is that activant. It's that salt that's added to a flavor that all of a sudden it pushes things into a huge dynamic change. So that's why scandal plays such a huge role in Japanese politics, and why we report on it so much.
Right. And also, I want to say to our listeners and viewers now, so if you have stayed with us this far, and of course, you will come again next week, we hope, but please tell your colleagues and friends about this series, these briefings, because obviously, even without our realizing this, politics and public policies, also economics and so on, they play a huge role on the business which we do in Japan, our work in Japan, our life in Japan. So please spread the word and tell the people around you so that they learn how things actually happen here.
Yeah.
And yes, it is important that it's not only for business, but for your life and your kids as well.
Yeah.
So Timothy, yes, thank you very much for today. We have exhausted the questions at the moment for today. If there are more questions during the week, of course, we'll answer them next week on Sunday again. To everybody who stayed with us, thank you very much indeed. We'll be here once again on Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock when David Sharp will join us, and we'll talk about human resources for change management. And of course, next week it will be once again at 8:20, Japanese Politics One-on-One with Timothy Langley and me as a host. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks very much, everybody. Timothy,
thanks, everybody. Thank you, Maya.
It was a pleasure being with you again. So we're looking forward to next Sunday. That's all.
Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
See you soon.